Hey guys! So when we left Mary and Colin, they were having just a wonderful time in the early morning in the garden. And this is the last sentence that I read. There was every joy on earth in the secret garden that morning, and in the midst of them came a delight more delightful than all, because it was more wonderful. Swiftly, something flew across the wall and darted through the trees to a close-grown corner, a little flare of red-breasted bird with something hanging from its beak. Dickon stood quite still and put his hand on Mary, almost as if they had suddenly found themselves laughing in church. "We must not stir," he whispered in broad Yorkshire. "We must not scarcely breathe. I knowed he was mate hunting when I seed him last. It's Ben Weatherstaff's robin. He's building his nest. He'll stay here if us don't flight him." They settled down softly upon the grass and sat there without moving. "Us mustn't seem as if us is watching him too close," said Dickon. "He'd be out with us for good if he got the notion us was interfering now. He'll be a good bit different till this is all over. He's setting up housekeeping. He'll be shyer and readier to take things ill. He's got no time for visiting and gossiping. Us must keep still a bit and try to look as if us was grass and trees and bushes. Then when he's got used to seeing us, I'll chirp a bit and he'll know us'll not be in his way." Mistress Mary was not at all sure that she knew, as Dickon seemed to, how to try and look like grass and trees and bushes. But he had said the strange thing as if it were the simplest and most natural thing in the world, and she felt it must be quite easy to him, and indeed she watched him for a few minutes carefully, wondering if it was possible for him to quietly turn green and put out branches and leaves. But he only sat wonderfully still, and when he spoke, dropped his voice to such a softness that it was curious that she should hear him, but she could. "It's part of the springtime, this nest building is," he said. "I warrant it's been going on the same way every year since the world has begun. They've got their way of thinking and doing things, and a body had better not meddle. You can lose a friend in springtime easier than any other season if you're too curious." "If we talk about him, I can't help looking at him," Mary said as softly as possible. "We must talk of something else. There's something I want to tell you." "You'll like it better if us talks of something else," said Dickon. "What is it thou's got to tell me?" "Well, do you know about Colin?" she whispered. He turned his head to look at her. "What does thou know about him?" he asked. "I've seen him. I've been to talk to him every day this week. He wants me to come. He says I'm making him forget about being ill and dying," answered Mary. Dickon looked actually relieved as soon as the surprise died away from his round face. "I'm glad of that," he exclaimed. "I'm right down glad. It makes me easier. I knowed I must say nothing about him, and I don't like to having to hide things." "Don't you like hiding the garden?" said Mary. "I'll never tell about it," he answered. "But I says to mother, 'Mother,' I says, 'I've got a secret to keep. It's not a bad un, thou knows that. It's no worse than hiding where a bird's nest is. Thou doesn't mind it, does thou?" Mary always wanted to hear about Mother. "What did she say?" she asked, not at all afraid to hear. Dickon grinned sweet-temperedly. "It was just like her what she said," he answered. "She gave my head a bit of a rub and laughed, and she says, 'Lad, thou can have all the secrets thou likes. I've knowed thee 12 year.'" "How did you know about Colin?" asked Mary. "Everybody has knowed about Mr. Craven, knowed there was a little lad as was like to be a cripple, and they knowed Mr. Craven didn't like him to be talked about. Folks is sorry for Mr. Craven because Mrs. Craven was such a pretty young lady, and they was so fond of each other. Mrs. Medlock stops in our cottage whenever she goes to Thwaite, and she doesn't mind talking to Mother before us children because she knows us has been brought up to be trusty." "How did they find out about him?" "Martha was in fine trouble the last time she came home. She said they'd heard him fretting and was asking questions, and she didn't know what to say." Mary told him her story about the midnight wuthering of the wind which had wakened her, and about the faint far-off sounds of the complaining voice which had led her down the dark corridors with her candle, and had ended with her opening the door of the dimly lighted room with the carven four-posted bed in the corner. When she described the small ivory-white face and the strange black-rimmed eyes, Dickon shook his head. "Them's just like his mother's eyes, only hers was always laughing, they say," he said. They say as Mr. Craven can't bear to see him when he's awake, and it's because his eyes is so like his mother's and yet look so different in his miserable bit of a face. So that's why Mr. Craven will only go look at Colin when he's asleep, because Colin's eyes are just like Mrs. Craven's eyes, and Mr. Craven can't bear to look at him. Drama. Do you think he wants to die? Whispered Mary. No, but he wishes he'd never been born. Mother, she says that's the worst thing on earth for a child. Them as is not wanted scarce ever thrives. Mr. Craven, he'd buy anything as money could buy for the poor lad, but he'd like as forget he's on earth. For one thing, he's afraid he'll look at him some day and find he's growed a hunchback. Colin's so afraid of it himself he won't sit up, said Mary. He always says he's thinking that if he could feel a lump coming, he should go crazy and scream himself to death. Eh? He ought not to lie there thinking about things like that, said Dickon. No lad could get well as thought them sort of things. The fox was lying on the grass close by him, looking up to ask for a pat now and then, and Dickon bent down and rubbed his neck softly and thought a few minutes in silence. Presently he lifted his head and looked around the garden. When we first got in here, he said, it seemed like everything was grey. Look round now and tell me if thou doesn't see a difference. Mary looked and caught her breath a little. Why, she cried, the grey wall is changing. It is as if a green mist were creeping over it. It's almost like a green gauze veil. Aye, said Dickon, and it'll be greener and greener till all the grey's gone. Can thou guess what I was thinking? I know it was something nice, said Mary eagerly. I believe it was something about Colin. Can you guess what he's thinking?